Right, we are listening there to the revelation about an alleged syndicate operating at the Reserve Bank, and Gloria Sefakomusi was speaking to the gentleman who actually stood up at the press conference held by Tokyo Suhwale when he was talking about the funds that he says they have allegedly been stolen from the Reserve Bank. But we'll have more on that story in our subsequent programs. And of course, today marks 51 years since the first Earth Day in 1970, and on that day, millions of Americans took to the streets to protest environmental ignorance and demand a new way forward. It has since been adopted around the world, and let's talk about it a little bit further. And Avena Jacklin is groundWork's climate and energy justice campaign manager, and she joins us now. Thank you so much for coming through.
Thank you very much, and good evening to the viewers.
Well, coincidentally, we're speaking to you now when President Joe Biden of the U.S. has just held a summit with 40 heads of state so that they can make a commitment about their emission reductions there. But then currently, are we still on course to keep climate change under the danger zone target, as it was agreed that it must be about 1.5 degrees Celsius?
Yeah, so just to put things into context, is the Paris Agreement aims to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and less than 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial temperatures. So the achievement of these goals is dependent on the achievement of the nationally determined contributions, or the NDCs. These are aimed at reducing emissions within each of the countries. So in order for us to be able to reach these targets, we need to make sure that the global emissions, the total global emissions, must be reduced by 45% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. The steeper reductions are obviously needed to increase our odds. And the longer we wait, the further we are from reaching this goal. But what's quite disturbing is that the combination of all these NDCs, all these commitments that were submitted in 2015, have added up to a global warming of more than 4 degrees Celsius. Now, these are reviewed every 5 years, and we couldn't do that last year because of the COVID. But this year, we have the second round of NDCs that are being put out. And it seems that it is unlikely that we will keep our temperatures to below 3 degrees Celsius. And South Africa also fails in this regard. So I think one of the other concerns is that, countries are not held accountable for their contributions or their commitments. So there are a few other environmental issues that we also need to be cognizant of. Is as much as countries are required to reduce their emissions and their greenhouse gas emissions, we also need to take into account that we will have temperature increases as well with the proliferation of wildfires, etc., that are resulting from climate change.
So now let me ask you this about climate change, which really affects people on the ground. Many people are watching this program, for example, when they buy cars, they pay carbon tax. And if one really pay a carbon tax, will this in any manner whatsoever benefit them in terms of behavioral aspects are concerned regarding emissions? Because sometimes people would say they've purchased a car that stops idling when it reaches a stop sign, the traffic light and so forth, and therefore they feel they are contributing, then why should they pay more tax?
Okay, so I think firstly, what we need to realize is that the quickest way to actually achieve our targets is to keep away from fossil fuels entirely where possible. So this means to not be as dependent on fossil fuels extraction, fossil fuels usage, fossil fuels for all our energy requirements. And as much as we have, for example, President Cyril Ramaphosa, who says that the country's response to climate change will be guided by the Presidential Coordinating Commission on Climate Change, the P4C, and that the Commission will work on a just transition to a low carbon economy and a climate resilient society, we still have dodgy power procurement processes that are procuring energy from gas. And so there are a number of gas to power applications in South Africa currently, and that is not going to help us reduce our emissions, but actually work in the opposite direction. I also believe that a lot of the energy solutions that are being put out there are not addressing the just transition aspect of energy. That is, we are not looking at the social part as well of our energy.
Yeah, a very interesting point that you are raising there when you're talking about the transition in as far as diversification of energy generation. Quite a very important one when you're talking about wind turbines. You're talking about hydraulic power generation as well as solar energy. Many people being disappointed every time when there's load shedding in the country and they want to buy solar panels. Now, you're saying governments are not held accountable, but the members of the society are also victims there when it comes to climate change because they suffer at the bottom end of the ecosystem regarding climate change. So what is it that can happen when it comes to accountability, and how should the countries that are the main culprits pay for their deeds?
Okay, so there have been laxes and given for emissions, especially with your big coal-fired power plants. What we're not recognizing is that we are in a country which has about 60% of poverty. That means, people cannot afford the cost of energy. And so how do we address the need for energy while also dealing with a social need for energy? We seem to be going for very large corporate structures of energy with extremely high tariffs. The whole idea, for example, of renting car power ships to supplement our energy means that we are locking ourselves into gas for 20 years, and we will be exceeding our emissions as well as being unable to afford energy. So we haven't really looked at the social aspects of energy. So, for example, we haven't looked at putting up PV on township households, for example, and actually meeting energy requirements in a more localized fashion. These very large grids that are meant to supply energy across the country are not necessarily the right solution for South Africa. And particularly if we're looking at a sustainable energy future. There are renewable options and cleaner options that can also be established in a short enough time period that is, like if we look at the emergency power procurement process, for example, where they want to upload a lot of this energy into the system by July 2022, and that is possible if we look at social solutions for energy as well. So this is a very critical part of the just transition, as well as ensuring that we are achieving our goal of a low carbon economy.
All right, thank you so much for making time to speak to us.
Thank you.
Well, that's Avena Jacklin, who is groundWork's Climate and Energy Justice Campaign Manager.